Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. Pick Your Poison, Volume 5, Story Number 1. Growing up in the Bay Area, everyone knew about the abandoned hospital on Presidio. You looked at it and it just gave you these vibes that something was off. Hundreds of broken window panels, taggings all over the wall, wires from the construction crew running throughout the building. It just gave off a paranormal feeling. Being young, stupid, and with a group of friends who all went out that night, sure enough, we decided to go to the Presidio Hospital, which was about a 30-minute walk from where we had been. There were 7 of us, walking, telling ghost stories to each other, and trying to scare each other. Me being a hard ass and never believing in ghosts till I experienced it myself, I just brushed it off as bullshit, and the stories they were telling went into one ear and out the other. Once we got there, I looked at my phone and saw it was getting really late, and I think it was around midnight. I looked up at the hospital, standing in front of it, and you could see a huge tagging of a skull on one side, and on the other side the words, "Good as dead." I smirked and we went off to the left of the building since the front entrance was barricaded. The back of the building had an opening that the construction crew used to go through. As we made our way inside, I looked up, and on the 4th floor, I happened to see what looked like 4 posters of Anne Frank on 4 window panels side by side. I kept staring at it, maybe thinking it'll move or something, but nothing ever happened, so I shrugged it off and we went inside. When we walked inside, I suddenly got this feeling like we were not welcome. It was a feeling as though something was watching us even before we entered the building. But being a badass kid, I didn't want to show any weakness in front of my friends, and we decided to continue on. We walked down the halls and peeked inside every room. Eventually, we got to the lobby where there was the main stairs, and we decided to go all the way to the highest floor of the hospital and slowly make our way down. Once we got to the top, being the cool kids, we decided to split into 2 groups and meet later on before we went down to the next floor. Me and 2 others on one end, and the other 4 guys were on the other end, and we agreed to eventually meet in the middle. Once the other group split up and we were down the hall, you could faintly hear them laughing and talking. I was in a room with my other 2 friends, and we were looking around and saw old hospital equipment. All of a sudden, we heard what sounded like rocks being thrown in the hallway. I walked out to look, and with everything being pitch black and only the flashlight from our phone available, I tried to shine it down the hall and the light was devoured by darkness. I told the guys with me, "Are you hearing these noises?" They both looked at me and smiled, saying, "It's probably the guys down the hall trying to scare us." I shrugged it off and we continued down the hall until we met up with the other team. After walking for a couple of minutes, we saw the flashlights of the other team's phone, and they told us that there was some beautiful tagging and artwork down the hall and that we should check it out. I asked them why they were throwing rocks earlier to try and scare us, and they looked confused and said, "We didn't throw any rocks at you guys. We thought you were throwing rocks at us." I rolled my eyes and looked at my other 2 friends that were with me and just shrugged it off. We started walking down the hallway and finally made it to the stairs to go down to the lower level, and all of a sudden one of my friends grabbed me by the shoulder and said, "Shut up. Do you hear that?" Everyone froze in place, and I started thinking, oh shit, the police are here, doing patrols, or maybe it's a construction worker. We continued to remain silent and look down the hall. All of a sudden, you could hear heavy footsteps, almost as if someone were dragging their foot as they were coming down the hall. We all looked at each other and put our fingers over our mouths in order not to make a sound and continued focusing on what the sound was. The footsteps started getting louder but maintained that slow pace of moving towards us. All of a sudden, as if, I don't know what, maybe it was like halfway towards us, when suddenly the footsteps turned around, and then it sounded like hooves stomping and running towards us. I had this feeling of sheer horror that whatever was running towards us was not human, and bolted down the stairs with my friends. Once we got to the bottom, we realized we ran past the lobby and ended up in what was the lowest level of the building. This is where it got really weird. I assumed we were in the basement, except it wasn't a basement. It was like a gymnasium locker room, like the ones you had in middle school with lockers all over in a shower area. We all looked at each other, confused, and didn't understand where we were at. We walked down a little bit and noticed an elevator that was out of service that had a handicap placard that read, "Only for students with disabilities and accommodating staff." I thought, huh? Maybe this used to be a school or something that got turned into a hospital later on. I continued to walk around with my friends and we suddenly saw what was a huge bank vault that was wide open in the middle of the basement gymnasium. My friend grabbed my arm and said, "Bro, let's go look. What if there's something valuable inside?" We walked inside of the bank vault and there was just a hallway that led to a door. Nothing else. Underneath the door, you could tell there was a light in the room and shadows moving across. The first thing that came to my mind was, oh, it's probably one of those dingy lights that's swaying side to side, probably from us running down the stairs so fast, causing it to shake and swing from side to side. One of my friends walked up and put his hand on the doorknob, and you could see in his eyes that something was wrong, like he wasn't there anymore. All of a sudden, he turned around and said, "Don't open that door no matter what." I laughed and thought, maybe this is some stupid joke of his to try and scare us. So I walked up and tried listening to see what was on the other side of the door. I can tell you for a fact that whatever was on the other side of that door was not human. You could hear deep breathing and what sounded like nails scraping lightly on the wall and the sound of someone sniffing very loud. I looked back at my friends and said, "What? What is that?" Suddenly I heard a voice on the other side of the door, inches away from me, say, "Come to me." In the eerest, most demonic and raspiest voice. "Come to me." I froze with fear and started to feel like my heart was about to explode. I looked at my friends and I could tell they were terrified. But for some reason, something was telling me to put my hand on the doorknob and open the door. I put my hand on the doorknob and all of a sudden, I was standing in a cemetery, confused and weirded out as to why I'm here. And I'm looking at the tombstones in front of me and see a row of my family's tombstones. And the next row was my friends. And this overwhelming feeling as though all of a sudden everyone died because of me took over. I started to cry and suddenly the ground started shaking and in the fog a black mass started moving towards me. I closed my eyes and put my hands in prayer and started whispering, "God help me." I heard a cackle in the distance and instantly woke up being dragged by my friends. I looked up at them. "What happened?" I asked. "Dude, you grabbed the doorknob and instantly froze. Your eyes turned gray and we tried moving you, but you had a death grip on the doorknob. We had to literally pull you off of it. The doorknob almost came off." I was so exhausted and mentally drained that I could barely reply. We got back to the entrance of the building and heard some security guards were making their rounds, so we decided to move back in and wait for them to pass. Unfortunately, they walked up to the door, shone the lights in, and ended up locking the doors. I got up slowly and tried shaking off my exhaustion and amping myself up, knowing this was going to be a crazy night, but to no avail. One of my friends said, "We need to get out of here. Let's go to the front." As we were making our way to the front, you could hear what sounded like hooves in the level above us following us. As we were making our way to the front, we were almost at the entrance when one of our friends looked into a room and said, "Oh shit, here's the morgue, guys." Our morbid curiosity took over and we looked inside. The windows were boarded up and it was pitch black. We used our phone lights to look inside, and you could see what looked like smears of blood or red paint on the metal frame doors. Some were open, some were closed. We decided to walk in and look closer inside. Our lights were reflecting off of the metal frames of the refrigerator doors. All of a sudden, we heard the host's footsteps. not above us anymore, but right outside the entrance of the morgue, literally on the other side of the wall. We froze and waited to see what would appear at the entrance of the doorway. All of a sudden, this huge thing, this weird apparition, was slumped over with its long arms at its side and the head tilted to the other side, and it walked past the doorway and let out a deep ha. Like this thing never learned how to laugh or tried mimicking our laughter but failed. We all looked at each other and slowly walked out into the hallway to look around and see if the coast was clear for us to run towards the front. We bolted together and the sound of hooves started echoing behind us, like this thing was running towards us with a purpose. At that point, we kicked the doors open to the front and looked down the street and saw a police car coming towards us from a few blocks away. There was a fence in front of us, so trying to hop over it would get the attention of the police, and going back inside was not an option. We decided to run along the fence to the back of the building from where we entered and stopped to catch our breath. I looked back up at the four posters of Anne Frank that I saw before we walked in, and they were gone. I told my friends about it, and at this point we didn't know what to believe, so we decided to call it a night. Let me tell you, the dreams I had of that thing that walked past the doorway still haunt me to this day. I remember vividly seeing the details of this thing and how it walked, the sound that it made. Just even being around the aura of this creature or this apparition was pure horror. It's been a long time since this happened, but after that day the seven of us never spoke to each other. After years of construction, the city ended up turning the abandoned hospital into an apartment building. I walked by there just for memories and saw a security guard sitting at the front. I greeted him and asked him about the place and if anything weird ever happened. He looked at me with the most sincere voice and said, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." I said, "Try me." Apparently, there used to be another security guard that sat in the back of the building patrolling that area to make sure nothing happened during the graveyard shift. He would constantly complain that there were four people standing on a higher floor of the building, staring at him through the window. I asked, "Did they look like posters of Anne Frank or something?" The security guard turned pale and said, "Exactly. Yes." He said they looked just like Anne Frank. I stepped back and was blown away. He then told me that the other security guards started complaining about the stench of rotten flesh and started hearing voices. Eventually, he was sent to a psych ward and no one heard anything from him ever again. The scariest moments aren't the ones that we find, but the ones that find us. Story number 2. During the years 1995 and 2005, I worked at a language school and witnessed events there that defy human explanation. I usually say that there are people who have a glow that goes far beyond their physical beauty. There is something about a person that commands respect. People who have a strong presence of spirit. I don't know how to explain it very well. And Susanna was one of those people, a beautiful girl, curly hair, a charming smile. Susanna's smile was the school's calling card when it was first starting out. Always very kind, smiling, helpful. But in life, not everything is rosy. Susanna met a boy and started dating him, and this boy, who was already a drug user, led her down the same path. She had not worked at the school for 3 years, and during that time, she became depressed, and unfortunately, she took her own life. It was incredibly sad when we found out. It was hard to imagine that such a nice girl would attempt to take her own life. However, I cannot fail to report what I heard and witnessed. I cannot fail to mention that after Susanna's terrible death, at least 4 secretaries who worked at night and had their dinner break in the kitchen at the back of the school, 3 reported more than once having felt the presence of someone in the kitchen with them, to the point that some, without the knowledge of the school owner, had dinner in the reception area, afraid to go to the kitchen at night. But the phenomena that happened to the 4th secretary gives me goosebumps just remembering it. It was the end of the year. The school was already empty. I was with Ingrid at the reception area around 8:30 p.m. Since it was the end of the year, there was a festive atmosphere, and because it was a Friday, we collected money and bought some efisas. The only people at the school were me as the manager, Ingrid as the secretary, Johnny as the pedagogical coordinator, and Wagner, the security guard. Since Ingrid had been sorting the students' report cards, she said she would have dinner later. At 8:30 p.m., she went down that dark hallway toward the kitchen. It is very important to remember that Ingrid had only been at the school for 6 or 7 months, and what had happened to Susanna was a matter that only I and the principal knew about, no one else. 2 minutes later, I heard the sound of Ingrid's heels running quickly, and she opened a door that limited access to that hallway. She was catatonic, terrifyingly scared. I even joked with her, "Ingrid, it's like you saw a ghost." When I realized that she had started to cry and sobbing, she said to me, "Get my bag from the back. I'm going to leave. I'm not feeling well." I insisted and said, "Wait a minute. I need you to tell me what happened. Because if the owner of the school calls here and asks for you, what will I say?" Then she calmed down and began to tell me, "Look, I don't know your religion, but I'm a spiritualist, and you can laugh all you want at what I'm going to say. But I saw the spirit of a woman in the kitchen," and she burst into tears again. Then I asked her, "Ingrid, could it be a teacher who came to bring a book? We always ask teachers to return teaching materials at the end of the semester." And it was at that moment that this speaker got goosebumps when Ingrid described the woman she saw. "We don't have any teachers over 1.75 meters tall with curly hair. Or did a new teacher come in?" Well, at that moment, I felt compelled to tell Ingrid Susanna's story. And then we both started to cry, lamenting Susanna's sad ending. I asked the security guard to stay at the reception, and I went with Ingrid to the principal's locker, because that was where we kept the photos of past events, and we would probably have a photo of Susanna. Very carefully, so as not to mess up my boss's locker, I found the first photo album from the school's first Halloween parties, and I didn't have to look through them very much to find Susanna's photo. When Ingrid saw the photo, she burst into tears again, grabbed her purse, and left sobbing. The following Monday, Ingrid quit her job at school. I never heard from her again. Next story. When I was really little, about between the ages of 1 and 5, we lived in a small mountain town in the middle of nowhere. It was a kind of town that truckers would stop for a bite to eat, the kind of town you just pass through on your way to somewhere else. We had moved into a house shortly after I was born, and the woman who had lived there previously swore the house was haunted. I never really put the pieces together until I got older. The woman had apparently claimed to hear children playing and laughing in the basement, but nobody was there. My family, being skeptical, didn't think too much of those claims. A couple of strange occurrences would say otherwise. When I was about 3, I would sit in the kitchen eating my meals, and my line of sight was the hallway. My mom claims that I would always stop what I was doing, stare into the hallway, and just point and reportedly say, "Horsey," and then go back to eating my food like nothing happened. She always got the chills when I did that. A story from that house that my parents like to tell is about a remote control car they bought for me as a gift. Every night when I was in bed, they would put my toys away, which included putting the remote control car next to the fireplace in the living room. They would sit down to watch TV, and out of nowhere the car would take off on its own. They were always nervous to put it back in its place. This became a regular occurrence. At one point they got fed up with it and took the batteries out of the car and the remote. They put the car back in its place and sat down to watch TV again, and yet again the car took off on its own. They ended up returning the car to the shop they had gotten it from, claiming that it was faulty. Since I was so young, I don't remember these two previous stories, but there is one thing I do clearly remember from that house. As a kid, I would often be playing on my own, as I was an only child. On a few of these occasions, clear as day, I would hear a woman's voice from right behind me. She never scared me, but she always stopped me in my tracks, and I would sit there for a moment, contemplating if I'd actually heard someone speaking to me. The strange thing is, she would repeat the same thing in the same tone, but it wasn't English, and I could never replicate what she was saying. To this day, I still vaguely remember what she sounded like. This wouldn't only happen at the old house. I remember it happening in my grandmother's place on one occasion as well, but it was always the same voice. We moved when I was 5, and I remember it happening once after that, and to this day, I've never heard her voice again. Next story. In Meriden, Connecticut, about 10 minutes outside of where I live, there exists a range of mountainous trap rock ridges called hanging hills. The easiest way to get to them is to park in a wooded mountainous park called Hubbard Park and take a trail that starts with a slightly intimidating passenger bridge that crosses over the highway. I'm afraid of heights, but always try to challenge myself by going hiking and putting myself in slightly uncomfortable situations to overcome my fears. In the spring of 2014, my wife, which was my girlfriend at the time, and I decided to take our umpteenth hike up hanging hills to see Castle Craig, a stone tower that stood at the end of the main trail and overlooks the cliffs. The city of Meriden and Quinnipiac Valley. For the umpteenth time, we launched into a discussion on the drive there about the legend of the Black Dog. I find ghost stories that have any shred of historical reality to them intriguing because most representations of ghosts on TV or social media these days involve people becoming easily scared by shaking or noises in an abandoned location. The legend of the Black Dog is an exception because it involves the legend itself and the story of two geologists from the late 1800s encountering it and actually documenting it. The legend has that you see the Black Dog of Hanging Hills once for joy, twice for sorrow, and 3 times for death. There are plenty of legends of black dogs in the folklore that tell a similar tale. The two geologists, W.H.C. Pynchon and Herbert Marshall, were conducting research of the area in the winter of 1891 when they encountered the black dog. According to the story, Pynchon had seen it once and Herbert twice before. Herbert didn't believe in the legend. After ascending the hills again alone, Herbert supposedly fell to his death. I remember the image of the black dog from W.H.C. Pynchon's story very clearly every time we hiked up the mountain. This time was no different. That particular day, my girlfriend and I encountered a hiker on the trail that was letting his black dog without a collar roam loose. We weren't sure whether it was to mess with people or not. The dog wasn't little like the one depicted in Pynchon's story. It was bigger like a lab terrier mix and friendly too. It came up to us and started panting at our legs. Sorry about that, the hiker said as he caught up to the dog and us. Not at all. I bet you love having a little legend with you around here. Oh yeah, the ghost dog, the hiker said, forcing a laugh and grimacing as if he had heard that one too many times before. As he walked away, my girlfriend made a comment about my obsession with the stupid dog and not wanting to hear about it. We made our way to Castle Craig about 20 minutes later. Unlike the trails of the highway, the main trail from the park is not long or difficult, other than a large hill at the end of it. We took pictures on top of the tower and by the cliffside, not really thinking anything about the black dog. We had made so many trips up to the tower and seen so many hikers with black dogs that the legend almost seemed like a joke at this point. Want to take the main trail down to the road? I asked as we finished up taking the pictures and drinking whatever water and Gatorade we had left in our packs. The road, she insisted. We can see the river. The road leading up to Castle Craig is typically taken by cars and bikers. We sometimes hike down to catch a glimpse of the Quinnipiac River on the way back to the park. Despite being a warm April day, there were very few cars and bikers on the way down. It was nice and quiet. About a quarter of a mile into our walk, my girlfriend tugged me on the shoulder and pointed to a figure on the side of the road between some shrubbery. It stood about 10 feet ahead of us. What the hell is that? She said. I took a step forward, but she tugged on my shirt and shook her head. Is that what I nodded. All I could do was nod. The figure was small and resembled a black dog with floppy ears and a hot dog tail, much like the one in Pynchon's illustration. I wouldn't have thought much of it if not for the fact that the figure was blurry. It wasn't the distance between us that made it blurry, and there weren't any fog-related conditions that day. It was almost as if Mother Nature had taken the dog in a Photoshop program and used the blur effect on it. Even when I took a step closer, to my girlfriend's hesitance, it still looked blurry. We were frozen otherwise, though, and didn't think to take a picture of the figure. There was an unknowing understanding between us that we shouldn't approach and just waited for it to cross. As the figure crossed the road, it didn't look at us. It just dawdled with its nose on the ground. For the rest of the hike, we were silent. We both knew what we saw, but couldn't put it into words. It was only after a while that I said we should have taken a picture from deep down. I felt it was a good thing that I didn't. Seeing the figure wasn't frightening, but it wasn't pleasant either. We've been back to the Hanging Hills many times since then. We never encountered any luck or sorrow, just the memory of a little blurry black dog and an understanding that when you see an actual paranormal entity with someone else and understand what it is, there isn't really a question about it. I read many stories about the black dog. Few have described what we saw, though. Black dogs run loose in the park all the time, and a number of encounters we read about seem like fabrications or just encounters with stray dogs. Next story. This happened maybe a couple of years ago now. I firmly believe the house I lived in at the time was haunted. Other stuff happened there as well, and including me being woken by a screaming twice. Once I was the only one who heard it. The other time my ex heard it too, but not our roommates. But that's beside the point. So one night I was sleeping and I rolled over and I was facing the edge of the bed, if that makes sense. I was sharing the bed with my ex-boyfriend. I rolled over and opened my eyes and saw a large dog sitting next to my bed facing me. It was dark, but the dog was darker. I could see the shape of the dog well, but couldn't see its face or anything like that. It was tall but skinny and had skinny, pointy ears. It reminded me of those ancient Egyptian black dogs I've seen before in movies and whatnot. Excuse my description. I have absolutely zero knowledge of Egypt and its mythology. Anyway, I saw this large dog and thought, maybe my roommate's dog got in our room? I blinked, trying to get my eyes to adjust to the darkness, and thought the dog figure would disappear, but it was still there in front of me. I blinked a couple of more times, trying to adjust my eyes, and the dog was still there. I propped myself on my elbow because I was about to reach my arm out and ask what I sleepily thought was my roommate's dog, how he got in my room, when I blinked and looked up and it was gone. I lay there confused as hell for a while. My ex and I slept with our bedroom doors shut, so the roommate's dog wouldn't have been able to get in. I could see the door and see that it was shut. Then I realized that I'd almost reached my hand out to touch this dog, and it didn't look like my roommate's dog at all. My roommate's dog was a chunky pit bull with floppy ears, not the tall, skinny dog with skinny, pointy ears I saw. My ex and our dog's Chihuahua, so definitely not to be mistaken for the shadow dog, were still sleeping peacefully next to me, so I ended up just falling back asleep. I never saw it again. Not sure what I saw that night, but I'm sure glad I never saw it again. Next story. I want to start off by saying I never believed in paranormal things until these events occurred. Everything that you're going to hear I've only shared with close family and a couple of friends. I've been wanting to talk about it and get my story out, hoping it will ease my mind a little. The time frame in which these events took place is from 2010 to 2011, and the location was Portsmouth, Virginia. My wife and I had been married roughly a year at this point, and she was pregnant with our child. We had been living in a high-rise apartment complex along the river, but with a new child, we knew we needed something a little more substantial. I was deployed for most of her pregnancy, and I encouraged her to find us a house we could rent with a few bedrooms and a decent yard in a safe area. My wife was raised locally, so she knew the area and had an idea what was best. She picked out a nice little house built in the early 1960s, roughly 1,200 square feet with a garage and decently sized yard, and it met our budget. I was deployed when she signed the paperwork and set up the move. An interesting tidbit that really rattled us at the end of all of this was the landlord said since we would have small children and the carpet needed replacing, he wouldn't worry about any damages that occurred if she was fine keeping the carpet currently in the house. He was going to replace it, but did say he just had it cleaned. There were a couple of bad spots in the carpet, which was very comparable to typical hotel carpet. You know, the short stuff with funky patterns and a lot of darker browns and reds. She agreed it wasn't worth worrying about if it kept us from having to pay to replace it eventually. Since she was pregnant, a moving company was hired to handle all the heavy lifting, and her family was happy to help as well. This included her uncle, a local homicide detective. When he arrived at the house, he got out of his car and looked around, almost confused, and my wife picked up on that. She asked what was wrong, and he said that he was pretty sure he'd worked the case at this house. Seeing the obvious look of panic set in on my wife's face, he stopped and played it off and said actually he just parked here and worked on a couple of houses down. His mistake. Spoiler alert, he did work on a case at that house we'd rented. So, that lays a little bit of the groundwork. My wife had been living in the house trouble-free for a few months. Our child was due to be born in late May, and I got really lucky to have the opportunity to fly home early from deployment to be there for the birth. This is when everything started changing. The first night I was in the house, and really for me, from the time I stepped in, I just felt like I didn't belong in the house. Like I was in some stranger's home using their stuff and enjoying their hard work. It's really hard for me to describe that feeling. The first night, close to 3 in the morning, we heard impossibly real footsteps in the attic directly above our room. Now the house was a typical small ranch-style house, long floor plan. The attic ran the entire length of the house. I only say that because it needs to be understood that we were hearing what was rationally impossible. It was 100% someone walking from one end of the attic to the other, pacing, somewhat rapidly, almost as if they were thinking about something that had them irritated and they needed to figure out how to fix it. This went on for a solid 3 or 4 minutes. My wife started to panic a bit and told me I needed to go investigate. I was trying to play it off, figuring it must be a raccoon or something that got in the attic. At this point, I still really didn't believe in the paranormal. I grabbed my pistol, a Glock 26, chambered in 9mm, and a light, and went to the access point for the attic. Now, there is only one way in or out of the attic. It's the typical drop-down door you pull with a string from the ceiling. I 100% believed when I went into the garage to go up that I would see the attic door had been open and someone was legitimately up there. I really believed I was about to have to shoot someone. When I got there, the attic was sealed. No one around. The back door to the garage closed and locked the garage door down, just as I had left everything. I hesitantly pulled the attic door down, and somewhat to my surprise, I found that the lights in the attic had been left on. Now, it's entirely possible that they had been on a while because, I don't know, my wife never went up there, neither had I, up until this point. But it did make me think that maybe I had a homeless guy camping in my attic. So I proceeded with caution. I went up with my sidearm and a light as carefully as I could, but my search turned up nothing. There was no one in the attic. No signs of anyone having been there, just nothing. Nothing at all. I went back downstairs, told my wife the coast was clear. Maybe it was something like pine cones falling on the roof, which is literally the biggest stretch in the world for what we heard. I knew it. She knew it. But what the hell was I supposed to say? This happened several more times over the course of the next year. I'm not going to go into as many details about the other events that happened, but I will lay them out. If one of those things that only when you look back do you realize that it was paranormal in nature. There were sounds of conversations in other parts of the house while we watched TV. As soon as I muted the TV, I could hear the conversation still taking place, but only for a split second, almost as if whatever was talking realized I muted the TV and could hear them. It definitely was not an echo either. There was stuff disappearing, literally things like bananas or batteries on a countertop. Would go to get them, they're gone. Come back to the kitchen an hour later, and they're right there, or I knew I had left them to begin with. This made me feel crazy when it happened, but I was the only one in the house, so it's not like my wife had moved them. There was the sound of dishes crashing in the sink, except we never left dishes in the sink. Everything was always clean, dried, and put away, but we would randomly hear what sounded like pots and pans falling over in the sink. Motion activated lights in the garage would go off all the time when I was home. Eventually, my wife noticed it only happened when I was home. My wife started to have really negative energy and anger issues in the house that started to cause issues in our marriage. And at first, we assumed it was postpartum depression. However, this changed immediately the day we moved out, and she hasn't ever felt that way since. And now we have 3 kids. Doors opened and closed on their own. Doors that were shut and the locking mechanism engaged in the frame. This never happened when we were at the house. It was more when we went out and came home to a door opened that wasn't there when we left. And then there were random sounds, smells, cold spots. I think that pretty much sums up our experience in this house. Now, where it all comes to a head for us was when things started going south with our landlord. He started treating my wife rudely when I was gone out to sea, and if she had issues she needed help with, he was a complete jerk. To be clear, I'm not talking about problems like a clogged toilet. I'm talking about things like our AC not working and the house being 90 plus degrees inside. He was really being a jerk. This set me off, and we opted to move out of the house. While packing up a moving truck, our neighbors across the street, who had always been friendly in passing, wanted to know why we were leaving. They said the previous renters moved out after a short period of time and had complained about the house being off and something not being right. She asked if we had any experiences in the house, and I shared a few of the things we had experienced. What she proceeded to tell us shocked us. She told us that there was a family of 4 that lived there for a long time. I guess several years, from the early 2000s until about mid 2008. The husband was apparently a known alcoholic with anger issues, and cops would be out at the house routinely. Sometime around the summer of 2008, he lost his job, and the landlord was evicting his family. The dad or husband ended up taking his life in the living room, on the same carpet that my family walked across every day. The landlord never had the carpet replaced, he had it cleaned. The day we moved out, her uncle came clean. He worked that case. He was at our house and made the call that it was a suicide. He also confirmed that was the same carpet. That really freaked us out. So at the end of all of this, I am now a believer. I also thankfully have not had any other negative experiences. We had only one really small thing happen at another home, but it was a one-time incident that never occurred again. So again, that's how I became a a believer.